Hey everyone, I am back. It's Matt Williamson coming at you for the last time this week before we have a real game. How about that? Pretty psyched up for this. Pretty psyched up for all of week one's action. Yesterday we talked about individual matchups with the Bengals having the ball. So we're going to flip it over here when the Steelers have the ball, some individual things to look at. But before we do, I think as it stands right now, I'm recording this like at noon on Thursday. So you'll be hearing it Friday. Maybe there's a little more news on this front. But I just wanted to address the Diontae Johnson injury and situation. If he is out, well, if he's in, you're going to see an awful lot, I think, of 11 personnel as usual. Johnson and Pickens on the outside, Claypool, that big slot. And that's actually a thing to discuss as well, is Claypool versus Hilton, their smaller slot corner. I think that's something that the Steelers are going to try to exploit out of the slot. That's on my list of different matchups to talk about when the Steelers have the ball. But anyway, I think the plan is Johnson and Pickens on the outside, Claypool in the slot, Freiermuth, Harris. Those are your starting five. If Johnson can't go, of course, I think you see a lot more 12 personnel. And I do think we'll see 12 personnel more this year than we did last year anyway. And that's 2 tight ends instead of 3 receivers. 12 is 1, 2, 1 is the back, 2 is the tight ends. And that would help in terms of the tackles. It'd give you more physicality. I mean, I think in general they're going to get closer to league average in terms of 12 personnel versus 11 personnel. They were very, very heavy in 3 receivers before. So if Johnson's out, gives them all the more reason. Put Gentry on Moore's side, help him with the blocking aspects. That makes all the sense in the world to me. But when you do go 3 wide, I think a lot of people are looking at it, and they might be right, that Claypool would then bump outside, Pickens would be outside, and obviously they would be your 2 receivers and 2 receiver sets with Gunnar Olszewski as your slot. I don't love that. I'm not saying we should never see that, but I think that Claypool-Hilton matchup is something they've been counting on all summer to try to attack. So what I would do is I would put a very big group of receivers out there, leave Claypool in the slot. Pickens, of course, is staying on the outside. And I think I would utilize Boykin on the outside. And instead of moving 2 spots, just put Boykin in for Diontae. So something to think about. Who are your best 5? I know Gunnar is loved, and you're going to love him. I mean, especially when you watch him on special teams. He is a wrecking ball. But I don't know that he's super hard to play against on offense. I mean, I think he's better slot option than McLeod. He doesn't have as much, big playability as Ray, but he's a solid player. Maybe the Patriots are wrong in not using him as a wide receiver hardly at all. They very well could be, but I don't think he's a difference maker on offense, and he's here to play special teams, folks. So I don't think he's the immediate replacement for Diontae if he's not to play. And of course, that would be a huge loss. I mean, not having Johnson in this game would be gigantic. I did talk about that a little bit before, but I do think a staple that they want to attack is Claypool in the middle of the field, as well as Freiermuth in the middle of the field, and sometimes he'll detach to the slot as well, against Hilton, against, linebackers, especially with Freiermuth. And I think that you will see a lot more throws in the middle of the field, between the hashes or down the seam, in the intermediate and deeper levels of the field. I mean, Ben just didn't throw the football there last year. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. That's going to get linebackers out of the box a little bit to help the run game, attack more blades of grass, as I always say in the passing game. They just attacked very few blades of grass last year. And then the wild card, though, and I'll talk more about Cincy defense on the back half of the podcast here, but I adored Dax Hill coming out of school. And in the moment, when the Steelers were on the clock at 20, I said I would take Dax Hill. I mean, he was my favorite guy there. No offense to Pickett. I'd rather pick it now. I was wrong. But it doesn't diminish what Hill can do. Hill can play deep safety. He can play cover 2. He can be near the line of scrimmage. He's a big slot. Maybe they'll even put Hill on Claypool if he starts beating up on Hilton because of the size differential. Maybe Hill plays man coverage on Freiermuth a lot of the game. So that's a guy to watch as their first round pick. I mean, I don't know how far along Hill is in terms of, is he going to be an every snap player for the Bengals? Because Larry Ogunjobi is really the only defensive player that the Bengals lost from last year. So they don't have a clear vacancy for Hill to walk right into, but they drafted him for a reason. He's unbelievably talented. His usage will be very interesting to me. And he's going to probably present problems. This certainly will, I think, in his career. I think he's going to be a great player. So let's take a break. We'll do a quick break here, and we'll come back and talk about more of these one-on-one matchups. Now, the Bengals defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, I say his name wrong, I apologize, is not a heralded, a well-known household name, as I just butchered his name. But he does good things. And first of all, this defense for Cincy isn't star-studded, but it also doesn't really have a lot of weaknesses. Trey Hendrickson and Bates are the best two players. Bates is a deep middle Minka type. Hendrickson's a very good pass rusher. Edge player, true defensive end. But they don't have star power galore, but they also don't have very many weaknesses. They drafted heavy in the defensive backfield. I mentioned Hill, and they haven't lost anything. So they finally have some good linebackers as well. Logan Wilson kind of runs the show. Probably remember him from last year. Made a lot of big plays against Steelers. But anyway, the scheme, the defensive coordinator, they changed things up in an instant. Like, you might remember when the Bengals beat the Chiefs in the playoffs. Patty Mahomes is ripping those guys up in the first half. Bengals make a drastic change at halftime, start rushing only 3, dropping 8 into coverage, real, umbrella type coverage shells. And Mahomes looks like he'd never played before, so they can confuse quarterbacks. They can cause a lot of problems schematically. I mean, even the best of offenses like Kansas City. And, we don't really know about Trubisky. I mean, his last stop, that was years ago, he wasn't a great decision maker. He wasn't an elite reader of defenses, so that's absolutely something to take a look at here is Trubisky versus defensive coordinator. You know what I mean? I also think that the Steelers, if I was in the the Bengals defensive coaches meetings, Steelers might be a little difficult to prepare for this week. Things are going to be different, but how are they going to be different? The Canada versus coordinator matchup, I think, is interesting because I do believe that we've only seen scratching of the surface in terms of what Canada plans to do with motions and unbalanced lines and play actions. And we've seen some, but really when I watch the preseason, they kind of look like most NFL offenses in terms of that, where I think they're going to be extreme. Last year they were extreme on the dull end, the static end. In the preseason, I think they've been league average with that stuff, but I think a lot more is to come. So how does the Bengals prepare for that? That probably isn't easy. You don't know. New things are coming. A new quarterback's coming. I'm sure you've prepared for designed rollouts and quarterback movements and things like that, and those are all coming as well. Plus, I don't think they're going to be spying Trubisky, but obviously the threat of a running quarterback is much different than the past couple matchups for these teams. So I find that very interesting as well. Another thing that you see a lot in practice and not a ton in games yet over his career is around Najee Harris. And I believe he was drafted to be a Lev Bell clone. And I mean that from a passing perspective. A big back that will detach from the formation, run wide receiver routes. Like, they throw him fades at the goal line, like he's Larry Fitzgerald or something. He is capable of much, much more as a route runner. I'm not saying his receiving numbers will spike because he caught a ton of balls, and he caught a ton of balls behind the line of scrimmage, his dump-off stuff. I think you'll see less dump-off, more route running from Harris, especially if they can move him around and see linebackers following him in man coverage. I think that's something that they'll try to exploit a lot. So keep an eye on that. When you see Harris not in the backfield, take a look at who's lined up over him. If it's a linebacker, I bet they go his way a fair amount. I mentioned Hendrickson. He causes problems. I'll admit, a year ago when the Bengals signed him, he had one good year with New Orleans. He had like 13 sacks. And I thought, man, they're overpaying a little bit here. He's an average athlete. He's a good player. He's not great. And then he went and did the exact same thing last year with Cincinnati. So it's 2 years in a row now that he's been at about double-digit sacks, but well into the teens. And I think that's what he is at this point. Like if you looked at all the edge rankings, the end rankings this offseason, you almost always saw his name in the top 10, and I won't fight you on that. I think he's closer to 10 than 1. He's probably about 10. But he's a very good player, and I don't know that Dan Moore is. Dan Moore is going to have to get some help with Hendrickson, and that could definitely come in the form of Gentry. Another thing to look at, too, Harris is very good in protection. I would imagine he will align to Hendrickson's side more, especially when they're in the pistol or shotgun and he's a boxcar left or right or whatever. He'll be on Hendrickson's side. And, this guy is not TJ Watt, but he's their most dangerous guy without question. But the rest of the front is quite good, too, for the Bengals. And I really like Sam Hubbard's fine. He's the other one. I would think Chooks will have to deal with him one-on-one more often than not. The interior of their D-line is quite good, though, and they're not household names, but DJ Reader is the modern-day nose. He's a wide-body, 325-pound nose, but he pushes the pocket, he can run, he's not just a anvil in the middle of the defense. You can do things with him, you can stunt him and twist him and slant him and things like that. He's really hard to move in the run game. He protects those linebackers, and I don't know that I trust Mason Cole yet, and I would line him up right on the nose on Mason Cole and try to drive him back and, make your quarterback, move left and right into Hendrickson and Hubbard, control the point, control those A-gaps, maybe even do some two-gap stuff with him, over the nose. But he can also line up on the outside shoulder of your center and attack that gap, with quickness. So he's a very good player. They have some good defensive line depth. The defensive tackles as a whole are quite solid. So the O-line, this is going to say this every week, I have a feeling, is going to be challenged. This isn't the best front they're going to face, that's for sure. It's not one of the best fronts in the league, but as is the case with the whole defense, it's pretty darn good, not great, and not, there's very few weaknesses. So Dax Hill is one of my favorite things to look at from their perspective. Use of Hilton, will they blitz him much? I don't know. But I will say that they generated quite a few sacks last year without being a heavy blitz team. I wouldn't think that they'll come out of the gates, blitzing like crazy. I think you'll see a lot of single high because Bates is single high safety. Jesse Bates is much more in the Minka mold. He's a deep middle guy, and I think they're going to want to keep people near the line of scrimmage. Based off former years' tapes in particular, take away the crossers, the quick hitters, the Johnson if he plays or whoever, play the run heavily, try to get you in third and long. And they might be successful, but I expect some deep shots from the Steelers, especially if you see a lot of single high. And I expect them to attack the middle of the field and more traditional routes than we've seen lately. Like, how many pure old school Ben in his prime to AB out routes did we see last year? Very few, I expect Pickens to catch a lot of out routes this year. Diontae to catch a lot of out routes this year. So I do think that the offense will be much more expansive and harder to play against. Whether they can block people, that remains to be seen, I guess, folks. But that is going to do it for me for the week. I will be back, probably tape one, right after the Steel game, Monday morning, I guess, something like that. And we will have a game to discuss, which is pretty cool. All right, over and out. Drop me a note on Twitter if you want, @WilliamsonNFL.